in the Carolinian zone of Canada. 35 of those years she spent as a biologist for the province, and the last 7 years as a consultant ecologist and president of 8 Trees Incorporated. Anne was mentored by the late Dr. John Plank of Limnoterra, and now Anne herself is mentoring young professionals in ecology and ecological restoration. Her latest work is in reptile hibernation, and she was the first to implement the concept of life zoning in terms of subterranean zones that support successful overwintering habitat for reptiles. She's leading the Massasauga Recovery Project in the Wainfleet Bog, and she is currently working with many partners, including Ontario Nature and the Nature Conservancy, in building hypernacula for the blue racer and the eastern fox snake on Pelee Island. And of course, I might also add that Community Voices of Fort Erie was fortunate enough to have Anne as their ecology expert for our hearing and during our work in trying to save Waverly Woods. So we're especially happy to have her here tonight. So I'll turn it over to you now, Anne.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping everything works. Okay. And from the beginning. Does everybody see that? Okay. Okay, this is a picture of Bacchus Woods Vernal Pools in Norfolk County to start us off. And I'd like to thank you all for asking me to speak today about ponds that are not vernal pools, especially stormwater management ponds. And the stormwater management ponds are really not a good replacement for lost vernal pool habitat, which is an example at Waverly Woods. And I hope to provide you with some insight into this growing concern, because this seems to be the norm now, that they are converting wetlands, these small wetlands, into stormwater ponds. But anyway, so this growing trend is to consider stormwater ponds as a replacement for lost wildlife habitat. And I can tell you I am concerned about that, because it's not the same thing. It's designed to meet engineering standards for water quality and outflows, inflows and outflows, but they're not designed for wildlife. Pond ecology is different than vernal pool ecology. And in Niagara, we have mostly vernal pools, and this stormwater ponds tend to be the absolute norm for end-of-pipe treatment of stormwater. So they need to be maintained. And if they're not maintained, they have engineering problems. And if they are maintained, they have wildlife problems. So these are systems that we really need to think seriously about before adding more on our landscape. So there are standards. There are provincial standards for stormwater management in Ontario, engineering standards. Some of them are to ensure that the ground flow and base flow characteristics are preserved. So that means anything coming in and going out of these things are preserved. Downstream water quality must be protected is another standard. Water courses must not undergo undesirable change, which means excessive erosion, or on the other hand, sedimentation, which is a buildup of sediments. They shouldn't have either one of those things happen. Stormwater ponds must not increase flood damage either upstream or downstream. So they're managed and designed that way. And they, in terms of diversity, of the receiving watercourse. So they talk about ecology and diversity of the receiving watercourse, and they shouldn't change it, is what is suggested in the guidelines. Okay. So they're good, important guidelines to meet. But if you Google stormwater management ponds, and Marcy, go right ahead on Google Scholar and Google stormwater management ponds and wildlife, there's over 25,000 responses in the literature. And almost all of them are concerns that stormwater ponds do not offer clean ecosystems for wildlife. And the monitoring and contamination and its effects within stormwaters is really important. And wildlife are attracted to these ponds, especially if that's the only water that's left on the landscape. Okay, and they're not tolerant to pollution. They affect embryonic development of especially amphibians, and contamination is an issue. Building up of contaminants in their tissues is an issue for longer lived animals as well. And it results in mortality or not, reduces the sustainability of populations. And it's just another factor that puts wildlife more at risk. So what is stormwater? So that is something that maybe I shouldn't glance over, but it's basically rain or snow melt that runs over the ground, and it could be over agricultural fields, suburban fields, urban areas, doesn't matter. It flows over the land and it picks up sediments or dissolved solids like salts and things, and then carries it on into these through pipes and things, usually discharged into a pond outlet. So storm water is usually dirty. There's dirty storm water when it's carried over the land, because it's picking up all these pollutants and contaminants. And they often, again, are discharged into stormwater management ponds. But there's also the alternative. There's actually cleaner. I won't call it clean because I wouldn't recommend you drink anything, but rooftop water is clean stormwater. Okay. Sump pump water is usually clean. All right. Sand filtered water is usually pretty clean as well. And if water is treated from a stormwater pond into another treatment, it's a lot cleaner. Like we call that tertiary treatment, or through a wetland or a swale system or something like that. It's usually quite clean. The dirtiest water is that first flush from a storm, and then usually water after that is much cleaner relative to the first flush. But it's still not good to mix this type of water in vernal pool ecosystems. Vernal pools have a really specific hydrology. They just receive precipitation water over the catchment and then infills these little shallow basins. They're not connected to streams. They're not connected to stormwater ponds because they're dirty. They bring contaminants in, and it lessens the likelihood of a sustainable vernal pool ecosystem. So when we are discussing stormwater ponds as alternatives for dealing with engineering concerns, there's engineering objectives that have to be met. There's often ecological objectives are met. Those come through usually in an EIS format. There's planning objectives and human safety objectives. All these things get thrown into the mix when deciding how to deal with stormwater in a development scenario. But it's really difficult to make one feature, the stormwater pond, fit all the needs of wildlife that they've changed in the site into just the stormwater, okay, stormwater pond. And it's really difficult to meet everything just in one type of facility, an open water wet pond facility. So the stormwater plans are there. They're an increasingly trend is to increase the habitat to attract more wildlife to it. And I say, please don't do that. Ecologically, it's just the wrong thing to do. They're designed to trap contaminants in them. And then you're putting wildlife, you're attracting wildlife to them. It doesn't work. It just causes more harm than good. And it puts sensitive wildlife in direct contact with poor water quality, contaminants. It lowers the fecundity, the sustainability, and puts species more at risk. So it's an ecological trap, and that's a term that we use when talking about Waverly Woods, because ecological traps are basically areas that are attractive to wildlife, either because it's the only place they can go, or it meets some part of their life cycle need, but it doesn't meet all their life cycle needs, and that needs to stop. We need to start thinking better. So my advice is to please keep wildlife out of some of these areas. And so there are implications to this. And an example at Waverly Woods was the exact same example. The plans are to enhance this area to attract wildlife. Okay, but there's alternatives that could be done. And you just have to think outside the box a bit better. To look at the site as a system. You have vernal pools, habitat, you have vernal pool community type amphibians in the area, you have wetlands, and you don't have to dump all the clean water into the stormwater pond and then dirty everything up. Okay, so there's ways that could be done here to to improve habitat for wildlife. You don't always have to dress up these areas to make them more attractive. So alternative is some of these dry ponds and grass swales. In this type of a system, the water is at the surface for a shorter duration. So it's not enough time to attract amphibians into it to reproduce. So they might use it, occasionally pass through it, but they won't use it to breed, and they won't use it for metamorphosis because there's just not enough water lasting there long enough. And you can keep the upper surface or the just below the root horizons of these grasses aerobic if you allow it to dry out. And if it's aerobic, it's better at assimilating nutrients and cleaning up water. Systems like this are not commonly used in Niagara region, and I don't know why, because they work really well to clean water. The canopy should be open meadow for this, so you can get the grass formations. Now, you can diverse this up a little bit with flowering plants and things for pollinators, but these systems are really easy for municipalities to maintain because they can go in and cut it once a year to keep the Phragmites from accumulated in here. Anyway, and there's something that we'd like to see more of. So grass swales leading to grass basins that dry out in a short period of time, so we don't get this attractive behavioral trap that amphibians are attracted to in these things. So another social consideration to vernal pools is that a trail around a vernal pool community, such as like the trail through Waverly Woods, for example, is a safe trail. Like, it's not like you've got kids running around by side steep slopes and ponds and they could fall in and hurt themselves. It's just a meandering trail through the woods. It's quite a nice setting for a trail, a public trail. So vernal pools are a unique type of wetland habitat. Okay, they are wetlands. Seemed to be a problem to use those two words in conjunction and during the hearing, but vernal pools are seasonal wetlands. Okay, they're typically small. They're shallow, ephemeral bodies of water. That's another word that's used to describe them. So there's no permanent inlet and outlet. There's no stream connecting the two. They're just these little isolated pockets of water that fill up with rain, okay, each spring, and snow melt each spring. And they dry up. They must dry up for a period of time in the summer, and that helps eliminate predators, aquatic predators in these systems. And that's incredibly important. And that's how you define a vernal pool. A vernal pool is not defined by vegetation, because the canopy determines the vegetation. And there's many different species that like different types of canopies. In vernal pools, there are many vernal pool species that like that variation. So chorus frogs would be using more of the meadow type vernal pools. Fowler's toads would be using shoreline pools. Salamanders and wood frogs would be using the forested pools. So it's important to know that the distinctions and the definitions. Now there's some literature I thought I'd throw in a nice little chart. This basically shows you different counts of amphibian activity, okay, over time, and time meaning how wet, how long water is maintained in the vernal pools. As you can see, there's a general tendency for the longer the hydro period, the higher the egg mass counts, but there's a trade-off, you see. Because aquatic predators are in place if the water is permanent, there's a trade-off for these guys. So they do well when it dries out in August and in September, which kills these aquatic predators and makes sure they don't get established in these vernal pool systems. It's a very bad thing for them. So vernal pools are found in forests, meadows, marshes, shorelines. Okay, the amount of vegetation, again, it depends on the amount of light and canopy. It doesn't. Vernal pools can have vegetation or they don't have vegetation, but they are seasonal wetlands. So the amount of vegetation, as you can see in this picture, it depends on the amount of light, of course, and the hydro period determines whether it's a vernal pool or not. So this, if it was in a permanent pond area, this would have pond breeding amphibians. But this in particular example is actually a vernal pool, and it has a vernal pool species in it. So this example, and you might see that some of those pictures might look familiar on the right, but are vernal pools in a marsh, edge of a forest, marsh, you can't go out and identify whether vernal pools are present in August or September. You have to identify them in the spring. They're not identifiable. They're almost unrecognizable when they're dry. To the experienced person, of course they are, but to the inexperienced person, they're not. They're identifiable. The one on the right is a picture of Catherine at Waverly Woods in the vernal pools there. Another example is the shoreline example of vernal pools for Fowler's toads. Fowler's toads are a vernal pool species. Yes, they are. They happen to use breeding sites along the shorelines. Creek mouse along sandy areas are common. Rocky pools are common at Nickel Beach. But in this case, that's again another picture of Catherine at Long Point. And she's looking at a temporary pool along Long Point that was used by Fowler's toads during her research. And they are very dynamic areas at Long Point, and they vary with lake levels. So when we had really high lake levels, we hardly had very good breeding in Niagara, but Long Point did immensely well during the higher lake levels because more and more of these vernal pools formed along that spit of sand, that lovely spit of sand at Long Point. And Niagara, we have barriers to it based on walls that we have, and I'll show you some pictures of that a little bit later. But we had a problem with our breeding sites disappeared from 2018 to 2020, and if that's when surveys were being done at Waverly Beach, there's no context if they don't look at the bigger picture there. The bigger picture was lake levels affecting the distribution of the toads and the successful reproduction, and the populations are very low in Niagara right now. So hydro period also relates to climate risk. This is some research done by Ryan et al. in 2014. The higher the climate risk, which is on the y-axis, relates to the hydro period. So the shorter the hydro period, the higher the climate risk. Okay, for these types of ecosystems. Vernal pools being, they must be occupied with water for at least months at a time to support amphibians and vernal pool invertebrates as well. So anything more than that is really not a vernal pool community if it doesn't have that dry out period. Okay, that's basically what that shows. And this one here is I took all the local amphibian species and considering all their life stages and their dependency on water, and I plotted it on a chart, a seasonal chart. So you can see vernal pool species tend to have this shorter length of arrow, basically. And the ones that have a more of a continuous arrow are pond breeding amphibians that prefer more permanent water systems. The northern leopard frog and the green frog are most similar. They have a period of time in the summer when they're sort of dependent on water. They go back and forth, similar to the toads, the American toads, the Fowler's toads. Once they emerge and metamorphose, then they stay close to water, back and forth. And then these vernal pool animals, well, they hibernate in the terrestrial areas around the pools. Okay, so they're dependent on not just the pool, they're dependent on the area around the pool. So you can't just protect the pools and protect vernal pool species communities. You've got to protect the areas around it. So just to clear that up, so you can see most clearly, the vernal pool species are your salamanders, of course, the wood frog, chorus frog, spring peepers, gray tree frog, American toad, Fowler's toad. Those are the ones that really key out to being your key vernal pool communities, the rest being pond breeders. So stormwater ponds would favor more of the pond breeding types in terms of successful breeding and life cycle requirements. Our life cycles for these vernal pool species, again, they require breeding, egg hatch, tadpole development, metamorphosis. That all happens in a short time period. And then juvenile dispersal, which means that's the part that's, you can't just protect one vernal pool and expect to have a vernal pool community of frogs sustained. You have to protect more than one pool and in the space between them so they can move between them to sustain the populations over time. They hibernate terrestrially. They don't hibernate in the water. So that's the other reason why you have to look at vernal pools as a system associated with both terrestrial and aquatic habitat seasonally. So the presence of, again, the vernal pool species and their breeding success entirely relates on hydro period and the presence of these amphibian predators. Okay, so amphibian predators are fish bullfrogs. They love to eat other frogs, and they will really go to town if on the smaller frog species here, their eggs, their larvae, the adults, all life stages. So a vernal pool in August, there's an area of woodlands that I was in just this year. It's called Fucirelli Swamp up in Halton region. This is a vernal pool paradise, really, but this is August. You couldn't tell that it's vernal pools here unless you know to look. And there's of course wood frogs everywhere around here. It's the other indicator, but you have to be aware of that. It's not, that's why they're missed. So they're difficult to identify because they are dry. So don't do the surveys in the late summer. Oops, did I go past that one? Okay, yeah. Vernal pool habitat to sustain a population, again, extends beyond just the water feature. Okay, and that is a concept that's difficult to do in development planning. Okay, it's best just to stay out of these areas and protect them in the long term. It's one system. Here's an example. The slough forest ecosystems of South Niagara, they're absolutely beautiful, more defined as you go westward. They're more diffuse in Fort Erie. They're not as defined a microtopography. But these and these dark areas on this map, these dark little pools, they're all vernal pools. And they're all a system that supports a diverse population of amphibians and a sustainable one. Look at all the pools that are present in here. And these are the ones that in between, they're small, but in between is terrestrial habitat, upland habitat. And they support healthy, strong choruses all spring long of various species, okay? Because there's good dispersal between these features. They don't have to cross, no roads through there. They don't have to cross through roads. So they can sustain themselves at this kind of scale nicely. And if you have a habitat like this and you don't hear those choruses, there's just something else going on here that's wrong, because there should be a strong chorus throughout here. So it's no longer a vernal pool when it's been converted to connected to a permanent water body. Okay, when they've been channelized or connected to streams or other permanent water bodies. If they get filled in, they no longer hold water seasonally, so it's no longer a vernal pool, of course. And if they get directly connected to stormwater management facilities that are permanent wet ponds, they are definitely no longer vernal pool communities. So some of the threats to seasonal vernal pool communities are that they really don't have as much protection. You think they would in planning, but they don't, because they're often missed on the landscape. And because they're temporary, if they don't do the correct seasonal checks, and they're small in size. Vernal pools also will no longer function if they're connected to permanent water body, right? So that's a threat. It introduces predators, as I mentioned before, the bullfrog, fish, those are all predators of vernal pool species. They are really only precipitation driven, so their own catchment is important. So no piped water going into it, none of that. The vernal pools are also are often removed in development, and I'm going to show you some examples of that next. Not just Waverly, it happens everywhere. And the vernal pool community, if there's no water left in the landscape, they'll be attracted to the stormwater management plan. And that brings into question the pollution, fragmentation, because they're small already. If they become disconnected to the other pools in the complex, then they're not sustainable. Okay, and that happened in an example in Welland, which I won't speak to right now, but I'm going to talk about a site in Thorold that we worked on this year with the Thorold community. And it was a really good case study, I think, that would be nice to bring forward to this meeting today. So this is the City of Thorold Frog Pond Community Restoration Project. Okay, there was a small vernal pool and associated forest swamp community that was clear cut in March 2022, so not too long ago. And it was part of an approved development plan to do that. Now the community, Richmond Street Forest Community, had protected or the frog pond area with an agreement with staff to not develop in perpetuity. And that was an agreement reached in the 1990s, but somehow it was lost in translation over time, and the area was still approved for development, which is why Carla Carlson was on that committee, brought it to our attention, and the community group got involved, and talking to all the politicians and the staff, and said, listen, we really want to stop this. Hey, this is the wrong thing to do. And so the city was motivated enough, they stopped the development, or temporarily stopped the development, revisited the plan, and they worked cooperatively with myself, A-Trees, the community, the developer too, and to remake the Vernal Pool Forest community. So this is a really, I think, positive, ends up being a positive example of a really tragic outcome that was happening in March. So here's Carla Carlson here. She leaded the way, really, but there's also all kinds of helpers, Rachel and et cetera, from the community group got involved. What was interesting to me was that it was they didn't seem to, I mean, the developer, the city staff didn't seem to understand that a stormwater pond wasn't the type of frog pond that they needed. So they thought they were making a frog pond when they made a stormwater pond. So they're kind of interrelating those two terms, stormwater pond, frog pond. But of course, it's not the case. Okay, it's the wrong type of community. This is a forested vernal pool community. So they didn't understand the ecology of vernal pools. So we had some nice meetings with them, discussions. The community again was really, really helpful in getting this motivated and getting things going. And we worked with the developer and the city staff, and they were awesome. And so we did a lot of mitigation work on the pond, discussions to try and keep the footprint of the pond where it was, mostly with reforesting and maybe create a little deeper areas, but we also had to protect the wildlife that were there at the same time. So it was a little complex that way. We had a lot of positive outcomes. They enlarged the terrestrial catchment for the pond. Originally, the plan was to just kind of stick it off in the corner, and then throw a pipe into it. And we had them change it so that it would be overland flow in the catchment for the pond that would get in here. We improved the areas around the pond to provide temporary habitat and cover during the summer, during all of this time. And we separated the stormwater pond, at least behaviorally, as much as we could, using a rock wall, which is not ideal, but I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. There was also, we captured a lot of the green frogs, the leopard frogs, garter snakes, and we moved those bigger animals to the Lake Gibson to the south, and we kept the chorus frogs into the pond. We kept shooing them back in the pond while they were doing any kind of work around here, so we didn't have any impacts during the development. We also had a tree planting ceremony with the mayor and the developers, and it was really quite nice. We planted a few rare species in there, some flowering dogwood and stuff, and we hope they do well. We also got approval for the very first eco passage in Niagara. And an eco passage is a type of passage under the road that's a terrestrial passage, so we can link terrestrial to terrestrial habitat for small animals and mammals, mostly like the frogs, because otherwise it would just be an isolated one pond, which again, as I've said before, is not sustainable in the long term. And monitoring to follow. So we're hoping to get the community involved in monitoring, and we'll do some of the monitoring too, but we'd like to get them helping. So it was a compromise. It's not perfect. There is a wall. So I think the wall separates the stormwater management pond, which is to the right of this picture here, and this rock wall along there. I mean, we could use it for people to sit and listen to the frogs. It'll be quite nice in the end. It's not perfect, but we had to come up with a way to separate the two. At least give them a hard time to going into the stormwater pond, because there'll be a tendency for that to happen, or a tendency for larger predators to go into the pond. So we had to come up with a compromise there. Then we had this lovely little tree planting ceremony with the mayor, and it was really good. And there's Carla and Rachel and community groups, and some of the tree people that donated the trees were there too. It was very good. So we still need to finish the eco passage. It still needs to be built under DeQ Road. And we still need to work with OPG to improve the vernal pool habitat along the shoreline of Lake Gibson. There's some depressions there, but they need to be tweaked, and it's full of invasive species, so that needs some work too. And community monitoring, which is what we want to do. So now I want to talk just a little bit about fowler toads. It seems like it's a new subject, but no, it's not. Again, this is one of your vernal pool species for the area. Again, it's an endangered species in Canada. It's only found along Lake Erie in 3 remnant areas. So Rondo Provincial Park, Long Point, and Niagara are the last 3 populations left for the fowler's toad. Okay, the habitat requirements are they need these vernal pools and rocky pool areas along the shoreline and at different elevations so that they can survive these changes in lake levels, which are happening more and more now. And the ponds must be in place at least for 120 days. It's up to, it depends on weather. Of course, they can metamorphose earlier than that, but that's the idea. And usually they're in place from, they start breeding mid-May, and usually metamorphs are out by late July, but I've seen them later into August. It depends on the year. And again, fish free, because fish will eat the eggs and the young. So some of the threats are in Niagara populations that are in decline since there's been consecutive years of the highest water levels the lake has ever had, and everyone who lives along Fort Erie should know about that. There's been a loss of nice sandy, fluffy beaches and dunes. There's been increased fragmentations along the shoreline. Here's an example at Nickel Beach, where the lake is eroded down to the base of these hard walls and creating basically a barrier to dispersal for toads to be able to get to the breeding site, which is in the distance. That blurry, blotchy stuff in the distance is where their usually breeding site was. So they couldn't get there from the dunes, which are this side. East of that, basically, they couldn't get from their hibernation areas to the breeding sites. And then the breeding sites were too flooded to sustain successful breeding. And so we had no recruitment for a couple of years. So that's a concern. So breeding sites are limiting across the region now that with the high lake levels and these lack of beaches for connectivity, and hibernation sites are also limiting in some areas. Nickel Beach being still good for hibernation, but toads can't get from one breeding site to the other very well. And the other site being Point Avenue being really good for hibernation. But again, having hard shore walls there as well. So Waverly Woods could help. Okay, it could help for fowler's toads. It's a good shoreline, traditionally has had fowler's toads through the years. Well documented by Tim Seburn's work and the Burt Miller Nature Club's work all along Fort Erie, which has always been very helpful for the recovery team to confirm that the species still exists out here. It's time to do that again. It seems like they're using a 5-year term now. If we don't find toads in 5 years, then the sites don't get protected, the habitat doesn't get protected, and that's just wrong. Because I mean, the maximum life age is 5 years, and you should at least double that, in terms of using the occurrence information to protect habitat. So it is possible to improve the beach connectivity. We just have to think outside the box here. It's possible to increase the open dune formations. Again, we just have to think more cleverly. And it's possible to create some breeding sites or some sustainable breeding sites that are fish free, that really they need right along the shoreline if we can. So if we could use the clean water and separate that clean water coming in from the upstream, and don't let it discharge into the dirty old stormwater pond, and have it as a source of water to help refresh and keep the areas from filling in with sand too much, because that is another process too that can happen. And it would help keep it sustainable, especially during higher water levels. These backshore vernal pools would be very important. But right along the shoreline, I'm not saying back shoreline, but right along the shoreline would be a good spot for them. So I had prepared a whole bunch of great research for this Waverly thing, but we didn't get to present all of this information. I can tell you though that it's important to realize that stormwater ponds don't have to look like that. They could look a lot cleaner, and they don't have to dirty up the water coming in to the system. So I want to leave you with some thinking, some takeaways that stormwater ponds are really not vernal pools and should not be enhanced to attract wildlife. Okay, vernal pool ecosystems are missed on the landscape and often overlooked during development plan reviews because they're small size and the time of year. And vernal pools are precipitation driven systems. Okay, they must dry out every year to sustain themselves as vernal pools and keep predators out. Okay, we can't have them, they should be isolated from other waterways. No inputs of stormwater, no poopy agricultural getting in there or dirty stormwater getting in there. And they're located in forests, meadows, marshes, and shorelines. Please, they're not just restricted to bare earth in forested areas. And they are highly diverse and productive ecosystems in Niagara region. Say thank you for having me. And I imagine if there's any questions, I'd be happy to talk to those questions. And I can stop sharing my screen if that's okay. Or if you want me to go back, let me know.